DJ's gonna.
Well, good evening. I'm Reginald Hardwick, News and Public Affairs Director at Illinois Public Media, WILL, AM, FM, TV, right here in Urbana-Champaign. And I want to welcome our live audience here at the Douglas Community Center in Champaign. Thank you for coming out on this wonderfully beautiful wintry day in Champaign, making out here, and hopefully our audience will grow. And for those of you watching us on the Illinois Public Media YouTube page. In just over a week, January 23rd, the Unit 4 Champaign School Board will vote on a new plan that would impact how parents choose their child's elementary school. Many months of conversations, surveys, and meetings with parents have led the district superintendent to recommend keeping this current schools of choice system with some tweaks. We are here tonight to talk about the core purpose of these changes, socioeconomic integration to promote better student experiences. Tonight we're going to talk about the present choices in front of Unit 4, our local history of activism, and national research on whether desegregation works. And we'll open up to questions from our online and in-person audiences, folks right here in the room and there on the YouTube channel. You can get right into the chat and ask us questions. After a panel discussion moderated by Emily Hayes, who covers education through the lens of race and rural communities. Good evening, Emily.
Thank you all again. So here in person, we have Dr. Asif Wilson, an education professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. We have Miss Imani Bazzell, a Champaign parent and activist who helped the district choose the choice system in the first place. And online, we have Dr. Toks Fashola, who is an education professor at American University. So first we wanted, and I should mention, we also invited Unit 4 to come here today. They sent their regrets, and Dr. Boozer couldn't make it. So we wanted to start off with a video that comes from a recent Unit 4 meeting where they brought in Dr. Amos Lee from the University of California in California Riverside, who's talking about a brief history of segregation here, the choice system, and where we are now. So if you'd play that, please.
In our history in Champaign, there have been patterns of racial and class segregation throughout the city, and there are still today patterns of racial and class segregation throughout the city. That is something that has not left us, but it is, again, an issue that's facing the entire country as well. So what does that mean? Housing was segregated. Black families in this community were only allowed to own land and housing in certain parts of the town, particularly the north side of town, north of University Avenue. Even prior to 1945, if you were a Black student attending the University of Illinois, you were not allowed to be in the dormitories with white peers. You had to live elsewhere. And oftentimes it was the Black community that housed and supported Black students, even at the university. So that gives you kind of a take on the historical legacy of Champaign, particularly after the Great Migration. And I think that context is important. The second context I'd like us to keep in mind is that there has been a systematic disinvestment in North Side schools. And there has been a systematic reinvestment of schools on the south end of town. And so what this duality has created in Champaign is that there were not enough seats on the north end of town for Black families that live there. And with the desegregation practices that were being pushed by the Supreme Court in Brown versus Board, what happened is you had students being bused from the north end to the south end. And so you had hundreds of Black students who were desegregating white majority schools in the south end of town. So if we think about it, when we think about burden, when we think about who bore the responsibility of having to desegregate, it was often on the Black families, right, who had longer bus rides in that nature of having to desegregate South End schools. Now, eventually, this kept going on, And in 1996, there was an official complaint filed to the Office of Civil Rights, which was about the unfair busing practices. And eventually that turned into a 2000 and a 2002 decision by a court that placed Champaign in an agreed upon consent decree. So the consent decree dealt with a lot of issues, right? Unfair busing of Black students, overrepresentation of Black students with suspension rates, special education placement, and an underrepresentation of Black students in honors classes. But one of the results of the consent decree was that the district had to implement a controlled choice plan. This is what you all know as school of choice, right? That's been ever since. And that plan was devised and made in a way where it was trying to alleviate the problems of segregated schoolings while still offering parents a choice in which schools they could go to, right? So that took away the neighborhood option. Also part of that plan was that they had to add 200 seats to the north side of town in order to meet enrollment needs there as well, okay? So since 2002, Unit 4 has been following a controlled choice plan, right, for school assignment. And that's been 20 years to date. And 2009 is when the consent decree ended, and so 13 years to date as well. I know this year, the board and in previous years have been looking to update or to reconsider what that student assignment plan looks like. And this is the process of that plan. And so I'd like to just end with just a few notes there, thinking about as we move forward, you know, just my take, looking at the data from the district, looking at data nationwide, is that, you know, oftentimes we want schools to be something that they cannot. And the truth of the matter is that schools represent society and the ways in which society exists, right? So all the societal issues that we have, the concerns that we have, the inequities that we experience show up every day in the lives of teachers, students, families within school systems, right? And so this is a larger issue that we're facing as a country as well. And given that schools are situated within our society, you have to be very careful about how you then go about making changes to alleviate those inequities, right? And I would argue that really focusing on the communities that need educational opportunities the most, making sure that you're focused on historically disenfranchised groups that, you know, may not be at the table but need to be at the table is a must when looking at school assignment plans. And oftentimes when I look at them, some assignment plans can go either way, right? Either they can be more equitable or produce greater equity in the district, whether it's racial, class, whatever else you're looking at, or they can enhance inequity, right? And so it just depends on how it's applied. It depends on the tenets on which they're established as well.
So now the question is, where are we now? The Unit 4 Board of Education plans to vote on a school assignment model on January 23rd. That's in about a week and a half. So we're going to talk about, I'm going to very briefly talk about the two options they're voting between. So the school board hired consultants named Cooperative Strategies, a lot of you maybe know, a year ago to help them improve the schools of choice process and further desegregate their schools. That was really in the strategic plan that they were following to get to this point. Many of us first heard about this plan in September when the consultant presented options that would have moved up to 90% of current students to different schools next year. So after parent backlash, pictured here, the consultants are recommending an option that would move very few students. So here's the so first, why would Unit 4 want to create so much disruption in the first place? I think I heard that question so many times from parents. In Superintendent Boozer's first email about this, she said that Champaign Unit 4 schools have always tried to provide excellent educational opportunities to its 10,000 plus students, but sometimes we fall short of that goal. And she explained what she meant with test scores. there are large learning gaps between Unit 4 third graders who are white and Unit 4 third graders who are Black or low income, according to state tests. Hispanic students have a slightly smaller learning gap. And so I was looking at different districts that are similar to ours. Urbana has similar learning gaps. Danville and Decatur have smaller learning gaps between student groups. But when I looked at that, it seemed like it was partially because white students weren't doing as well as they are in our community. So let's get to the two options. The recommendation moves less than 10% of students, and it uses the current choice algorithm to try to balance economic integration across schools. They just are using the same formula that they've been using, but they are setting parameters where new students, you know, the class can't be but so far from the, you know, highest income school can't be that different from the lowest income school. And they're also tweaking some things like the deadline that families have to register, making more flexibility for families who come in late. So here the gray bar represents, you know, this end represents the lowest poverty school in the district. So that would be South Side this year, with about 1 in 3 students qualifying for free or reduced lunch. On that side, the highest poverty school is Garden Hills, and that's where 3 in 4 students qualify for free or reduced lunch. Now there are some changes happening to individual schools. Really important to note that Garden Hills would get full day pre-kindergarten and middle school added as part of this plan. International Prep Academy would get full day pre-K. It already has middle school. Barksdale and Kedwood would lose their balanced calendar, and anyone who takes their child to school, drives their child to school, will get reimbursed for the transportation. So they're trying to kind of solve a bunch of different problems that the district was hoping they would do with school assignment. Some elementary schools will feed into different middle schools. There's a little chart that you also have in your PowerPoint slides about that, and how current middle school students, their siblings can stay with them. The other option is a cluster model. Maybe you all heard of that. Maybe you've voted on which one you wanted. That would bring the economic balance of each cluster closer together, of each school closer together, hopefully. So again, basically, wherever you live, you're in a cluster, and then that cluster is completely socioeconomically balanced. But you're still getting to choose a school. You just have fewer schools to choose from. So lastly, I want to highlight all the different ways you can send us questions tonight. You can text questions for the panelists at this number, 217-803-0730. We have index cards back there that you can write up, and we'll be collecting those. Or online, you can type in the YouTube chat, is I believe the way we're doing that. So the questions that I have for our panelists, let's get started with Dr. Fashola, who again is an education professor at American University. So for Dr. Fashola, what can desegregation do when it works? Like, why would someone want to desegregate?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to this. Emily, how many minutes do I have to answer this question?
You have 5 minutes.
I have 5 minutes. It is 2:20, my time, so in 30 after the hour, at 6:30, I will stop. So why would one want to desegregate? For a number of reasons. What research has shown is that integration has helped African American children academically and into adulthood. For instance, African American students who attend uh, desegregated schools are usually more likely to graduate from high school. They are less likely to live in poverty. The next generation of students, of the children who attended desegregated, desegregated schools, are more likely to attend college. Okay, the students also are more likely to attend college. Now, what is interesting is that it decreased dropout rate, but um, there were no negative impact of desegregation for the white students. Um, why would African American parents want their children to go to um, desegregated schools? Well, desegregated schools tend to be better resourced. They have smaller class sizes, they have better quality, higher academic achievement, better climate, better graduation rate, and what we refer to as a sleeper effect is the fact that after graduation, they are not only well balanced in life, but they're also, as I said earlier, more likely to have access to um, positive choices in terms of schooling, in terms of opportunities and work in the future. But one thing that we tend to forget is that the flip side of desegregation and busing is something that has benefited not only African American students, but has also benefited white students and parents, and that is magnet schools. Magnet schools are indeed a part of desegregation and civil rights. And what tends to happen is that with magnet schools, the young non-black students, for the most part, tend to go they are also to schools in African American neighborhoods. The difference is that while African American children are placed in the classroom with the white students, with magnet schools, the white students are placed in specialized magnet schools that have higher academic achievement, specialized programs, and the list goes on. And until more recently, were less likely to interact with African American students. Moving forward, additional reasons why we say that desegregation is better in the long run. What we find is that students who attended desegregated schools in which both parties, parents of both entities, chose to voluntarily desegregate after the desegregate either consent decree or order were provided, what we found is that the children were a lot adjusted in the classrooms. They were a lot better adjusted in the schools. And what I mean by that is that the students were less likely to feel isolated, either racially or socioeconomically isolated. So, in the long run, you think about transformational learning theory, and basically, when we do well for one group, we do well for everyone. Okay, when we decide to open our arms and open up our schools and face these inequities and injustices, not only do we do well for them, but we do well for the city, our state, our county, and our country as a whole. And I did it. I have 1 minute to go. Yay.
Yeah, congratulations. A whole minute plus. Um, okay, so we heard about some of, what going to desegregated school can mean: smaller class sizes, more resources in the school. Dr. Wilson, would you talk a little bit about what has been lost with desegregation in the past?
Sure. So I'm a teacher, so I'll try to be a teacher-like for y'all to engage you. So when you think about Brown v. Board of Education, the sort of federal lawsuit, eventually, which was a series of local lawsuits that made it to the federal level that initially across the country set forth precedent to desegregate schools, right? I want to just locate that for a second with everybody. When you look at the plaintiffs, who were largely black families in the South, their wants from those lawsuits were not about sending their children to other people's schools. It was not actually a quest for integration. It was a quest to have resources in the schools local to their own communities with folks who look like them. And so when we think about what resulted after Brown v. Board, it's primarily integration, right? Is seen as the solution. So the question I ask is, what then gets lost? Maybe it's not captured in the outcomes we see via test scores, but maybe it's captured in the dramatic decreases in black teachers. Like cities like Baltimore, Maryland, when overnight 100% of black teachers were fired from the school system and replaced by white teachers. And I'm not saying white teachers don't have the capacities to engage with black students, but you're talking about teachers who lived in the same neighborhood, who went to the same churches, who attended the same grocery stores, who knew parents. And I began to ask a series of questions, and other education scholars, what gets lost when we disrupt that? And the same goes for any community. And so when we fast forward to 2009 and 2013 and now 2022, I think we need to ask the same set of questions. What are parents, communities, and young people in the city of Champaign asking for out of schools? And then how can those services and needs be met in local spaces that don't require a parent to have to get in a car and drive? Well, I work with a lot of parents who don't have cars. I work with young people in Chicago who have to travel an hour and a half to go to school. I don't think black parents who were trying to get equal opportunity through education were asking to have to travel an hour and a half to drop off their children to school. I don't think they were asking to have to make a choice about what school their children would go to offer them a quality education. I don't think they were asking to turn themselves into educational researchers who can migrate and analyze a bunch of convoluted data to help make educational decisions about the outcomes of their children. I think what they want are caring relationships in schools that build healthy ecosystems of love, care, and transformation, so that the young people that leave those schools can go back to their communities and continue to transform them. When I look at research on Brown v. Board, when I look at research on what black parents and students want for their education out of their schools, they want that. And so the question becomes, how do we move towards that as opposed to moving towards something else that doesn't capture that?
We have a couple minutes where we could have other panelists weigh in on that question if you wanted. I know we'll have questions later as well. So why don't we go ahead to Ms. Bazzell? What were you hoping would happen in the 90s when you were getting involved, when Unit 4 adopted the choice system? What mattered to you in that time?
Am I on? Yes, I'm on. Quickly, in 1974, speaking of Brown, there's a series of things that got us to this point. One of them, in 1974, the Boston School District decided that they were going to integrate their schools, and the parents in South Boston lost their minds. They were trying to bus black children to their neighborhoods, and they were throwing rocks and eggs and tomatoes at them. They were holding their children back from going to school, and it became contagious. And I lived in Milwaukee at the time and was starting high school, and my high school caught the fever, and fights broke out in my high school. My high school actually had to close, and a series of community interventions had to happen, where at a young age I got my first human relations training. This isn't about me, though. This is about coming full circle. Well, turns out the programs that were eventually implemented in the Boston schools and the Cambridge schools came to visit us here in Champaign. So back in 1996, 97, 98, when we were organizing as a black community, when we were able to identify a law firm out of Chicago that was going to help us and certainly make sure we had a seat at the table. It turns out the architects that we brought in to put together what was called an equity implementation plan. So see, this wasn't just about school assignment. It was about implementing a plan for educational equity. Well, the consultants we brought in to do that were the architects of choice. And so that's how we ended up pursuing schools of choice in Champaign, and how my story became full circle, because these were the same people from a couple decades before in my own life. So the point that I want to make here is to piggyback off of what Asif was saying, in that locally, we weren't looking to sit next to rich kids or white kids. We were looking for educational equity. And so, just as Asif said, we were concerned about a lack of seats on the north side of town, which is where most African Americans' families lived. We were concerned about the overrepresentation of African American children in special education, disciplines, suspensions, expulsions, what have you, and the underrepresentation in what we eventually began to call a college-going culture. We were underrepresented in the gifted and talented program and advanced placement, in anything that had to do with our children being successful in school and in life. We were on the bottom. And so that's what we were concerned about, addressing those issues, and we were able to put systems in place to address those, and somehow I think equity has gotten lost in this discussion.
A follow-up question for you is, one of the things that I found really cool when I interviewed you was about how during the choice and consent decree, you had a formal seat at the table with other Black families. Can you tell us about that? What brought the Black community together? How can people replicate that now?
Well, I hate to have to hire another law firm. What you say, Ty, you hate to see that happen too, huh? To be perfectly honest, there were many bold and courageous people, African American adults, family members, parents, who cared about these issues for many years. It actually wasn't until we had a local rich white man who cared about these issues, who partnered with us and paid for the lawyers initially. That's when the press started covering it. That's when the school district started taking us more seriously. And we put systems in place that would ensure a continuous seat at the table. I'm afraid that in the last number of years, that has been lost. And that's why community organizing is a constant and evolving thing. We did a lot of good work in the 90s, in the 2000s, in the 2010s, that the systems that we had in place, the PIC, which was the Planning and Implementation Committee, that again had to do with implementing equity. We don't have something like that anymore. When the consent decree was over, that was disbanded. I would advocate another one or something similar.
And at PIC, did you have, was your sign off required before, did you have formal power?
Yes, we did have formal power because we were the plaintiff class, and at that point we had a consent decree, so it was being overseen by the courts. E3, I should back up and say, we formed our own organization called CARE3, Coalition for Action on Racial Equity and Excellence in Education. And out of that effort came the proposal to do the Great Campus, which we're seeing some signs of in, is it scenario 4, I think, to do the pre-K 8 scenario. We proposed that a long time ago. So it's exciting to see that that might happen. We've also, over the years, proposed, and I would like to see efforts to embrace that whole community, the north side of town, which we call the Promise Zone, that a lot of work has been done on. There we're talking about implementing what we call full-service schools, and I know this isn't the venue to go into that, but I would encourage the live audience and the listening audience to pursue that further. What is a full-service school? Because when we talk about what do we need for African American kids and families, what do we need for low-income kids and families, what do we need for segregated low-income kids and families, we need what we call full-service schools. The whole idea, for me, this is about an exercise in democracy. And so some people talk about maybe forget it, we'll get a charter school, we'll do this and that. For me, I want to make public institutions work. Sure. Because I believe in democracy, and many of us here believe in democracy. And so this is an exercise in participatory democracy. To have fully functioning, useful public schools is about the larger question. And I want us not to lose sight of the larger context. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Great.
Would you like to use? I'll repeat it then.
Well, everybody needs to hear you.
Card. That's my responsibility as a parent. And as a District 4, Unit 4, the responsibility of the entire district should be equity across the board. It doesn't matter if it's Barksall, if it's Garden Hills. My son was going to Garden Hills last year. He had a certified sub the entire school year. So I don't understand by expanding what they offer and giving them more classes, more whatever, is going to improve the quality of the education. And then I believe last year, BTW right here also had the lowest test scores, which is also interesting when I believe you said that there was a monetary thing you said where certain districts have more resources than other schools. I feel like that is the problem. Because it does, I mean, really, desegregation has been since 1954. BTW is one of the most diverse schools in Champaign-Urbana. And so it's shocking that that the test scores that they have are what they are. You look at IPA. The only reason why IPA's population is a high Latinx because they're a dual language school. If I was a Spanish-speaking person, that's the first place that I would send my kid to. That just makes logical sense. And the only reason why my kid had to go to Garden Hills is because I registered them late. But on the flip side, I had to suffer because I was dealing with a certified substitute the entire school year. So that I feel like that's the real reason why we're here. I mean, I respect the history. I'm not from Champaign. So I'm wondering what is what we're talking about, why we're here. How is that going to actually change the quality of the education that is being provided to the students? Black, brown, white. Like the race portion doesn't matter. When I register my kid, I don't identify what my race is because that's discriminatory. So that portion to me is irrelevant. What about the quality of the education that's being provided to the students district-wide? You have 10,000 students in the district, and certain schools have more funds, more allocated resources. I think that's the bigger issue that we need to address instead of, oh, I don't get to choose the school I want to take my kid to, or, oh, I got to drive across town. My kids go to BTW. I don't live anywhere near here.
Yeah, and I have heard, I heard many parents echoing, having the same concerns as you. So one thing that I heard from the district in response to that is, for the longest time, schools have been unequally resourced, like you're saying. However, they say that in the past couple of years, and when I was looking at the numbers, I think this was right, that Garden Hills is getting more money than Southside from the district. So that's why they're saying, you know, when integrating makes it, you don't need such a difference in resources to even get enough teachers to teach all of the classes. I think that was their logic. Do you guys have further responses?
Amen. I think everything you said is what we said. Nobody up here is representing the school district. The school district didn't have a representative on the panel. I'm here to speak as a former parent and as a community organizer and a racial justice educator and organizer, that what we need is equitable schools. And so it doesn't matter what school you go to, just like you said. The plaintiff class was never invested in that question of, ooh, I want to go to this school instead of that school. What we wanted was equity in the schools, whatever school you go to, so it doesn't matter, because the whole district is organized to meet the needs of kids and families. And that's what I meant about public schools being an instrument of true participatory democracy. So good for you, bro.
I guess time to open it up for questions, which I was already considering. Hold on, let me plug for our online audience. You know, you can still text us questions at 217-803-0730, and let me check if we have any online questions yet. We also have index cards.
And we have one, yes. Question over here, too.
It's 217. Great. Yeah, there are also cards with it. That's great. Let's see. Okay. Yep, I think I'm seeing that. Yep. I see your question. All right, so then now let's go to the next in-person question.
So I just had a follow-up to sort of this exchange that happened. When we talk about resources, one thing that I heard was certified sub for an entire school year. The response to resourcing schools equitably is not always a question of money. So when we're talking about certified subs for an entire year within Garden Hills, entire grade levels missing certified teachers. Meanwhile, my kids go to the South Side. South Side has historically had the highest teacher retention in the district. So it's more than, we give more dollars there, so what are you talking about? It's, in my opinion, it's looking at the school community, the families who are there, and resourcing the school effectively.
A good point.
My question is to you, who was on the committee years ago when this all came about. What is the view of those people as to what's happened since then? Did what you worked so hard for ever get close to being accomplished, or did the movement, I know there was a consent decree, but from my vantage point, I don't know that I would have ever thought it did what it was supposed to do. What do you think?
I think that it takes time. It took so long to mess our public schools up in terms of how they really meet the needs of the public. And I think that we were on a really good trajectory. And that's why it's really important to be clear about who's running for your school board, who you're hiring to be your administrators and teachers, how we're supporting, how we're doing professional development. One of the things we did, you all know now that there's not a gifted and talented program anymore, but one of the things that we did to try to put a system in place to help all kids was that all elementary school teachers would get gifted levels 1 and 2 training. So it didn't matter. It shouldn't matter at some point whether you're in a self-contained classroom, because if it's best practices that these teachers are implementing in their classroom, we want that for all kids. So I still like to see programs like that, and we just need to get more robust about it now. And I think support the administration and support those on the school board who want to see the kinds of changes and improvements that we want to see to really fulfill this vision that we had that has yet to be filled, if that was your question. Not completely, no.
But you did have some progress.
Oh, yes, yes. I think if we could reclaim some of the systems that we put in place that have been lost, we would see some real improvements. Yeah. So I think we need more people to coalesce, to put more pressure on, to support those in the school district who are trying to do right by all of us.
Dr. Fashola also wanted to add something.
Yes. So I don't know, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Not well,
So
though?
I had a few.
Yeah,
Okay.
I also am not
I'm
hearing
trying
you
my
say.
best.
Oh,
Um,
Dr. Fashola, some of us
Can you
aren't
hear-
hearing you very
Yeah.
clearly, like we can hear your sound, but I think along the way it's kind of garbling. I don't know if you can like enunciate 20 times more forcefully than you would normally, and maybe we can hear. I don't know. Do you want to try?
Okay, I will try.
Thank you.
A couple of things. After my first comment, I want to make it clear that, in my role, I have taught. I'm a former Head Start teacher. I'm currently a research professor and a senior professorial lecturer at American. Research is important, and data are very important. Data are what have been used to basically help to make decisions. And when I say data, I don't only mean numbers, but I also mean observation, and I mean testimony. The second thing that I wanted to say is we have to look at the context in which we are living now. A lot of the rights that we gained in the 50s and 60s are being rolled back. Voting rights, okay, basic rights, affirmative action, desegregation, they are being rolled back. So on our way back to where we were prior to the desegregation decree. The other thing that I want to make clear is that do I believe that in order for African American students to do well, they have to sit in classrooms next to white students? Absolutely not. What I am saying is that basically, as has been said, you have to have an equal amount of resources. You have to have equitable teaching and equitable conditions. But most importantly, in addition to that, one of the things that we have found is that the schools, the district, the teachers who are teaching the students, and the communities overall have got to understand that separate from desegregation, access to a high and quality education is priority. So one of the things that we are doing at American University and in the District of Columbia is what's called a Grow Your Own program. We at American University have the teacher pipeline program, and similar to what my colleague had said, one of the things that we have said is, you know what? We're going to train teachers locally in our own local universities. We will take the high school student, we will create a grow your own program, and then the students get the degrees, they get the education, they go back into their own community that they know and they teach. And with our program at American University, when you do that, you are guaranteed a job, you pass the classes, and you can help to change your own community. Okay? But the other thing that I want to make sure that, and parents have talked about this again and again, and I agree 100%. It's not just the amount of money that's going into the school, and it's not just how beautiful the school is. When we talk about equity and we talk about injustices, what we are talking about is the quality of the school. So I do agree.
Dr.
That you need to
Fashola,
see-
you cut out a little bit. So what I've heard so far is I heard you saying you're not saying that black kids need to sit next to white kids to succeed. That's not at all what you're saying. I heard that. I also heard you talking about, I think, your dual enrollment program at American University, where... Sorry, American...
Teacher pipeline program.
Teacher pipeline program, okay.
And grow your own, yes.
Okay, teacher pipeline program, I did not hear that. And I also heard you saying that it's agreeing with our audience member that it's not just about monetary resources, it's not just about how pretty the school is, but then you cut out right after that.
No, and so the other thing that I'm saying, it's also about how those resources are used in an equitable way, in order to give the student and the family a quality education. I'm going to say one more thing. Remember, many schools are funded based on taxpayer dollars, based on the cost of property taxes. Okay? The higher the property taxes, the more money that goes into the schools, the more money will be allocated, but also the less likely you will be to have what we have seen in many districts or in many schools, as has mentioned here, the long-term subs,
You cut out again a little bit, but I did hear your point that the way schools are funded are with taxpayer dollars, and so the more taxpayer dollars going to a school, to a district, the more well-funded it is. And then
to the schools, but also, yes. But also, the less likely the schools are going to be to have what has been discussed, such as long-term stuff and underqualified teachers.
Okay, so you're saying that also the districts that have the most money are also the least likely to have, regardless of how much money they have, the least likely to need long-term subs, basically.
Because,
Emily, we have a question.
And it's not only because the district, it's not only because it's the district, because of the areas, the property values.
I'm sorry, Dr. Fashola, this is our fault, but we can't hear you. I'm so sorry. I love what you're saying. I know it's all good stuff.
We have a question over here.
If I could, before we go to the next question, I'm sorry, sister, but I think what Dr. Fashola was maybe pushing us to think about is if we start to look at the way funds are utilized in schools, then we might ask a series of different questions outside of, we just need more dough in my school. And so when we look at working class schools where students of color make the majority of the populations up, We see lots of expenditure on test prep materials. We see lots of expenditure on remediation. Because of the overrepresentation in special education, we see expenditures in special education. And now you have to remember that schools don't get money that they necessarily need. They oftentimes get money based on the number of students they have in that building. And so you create this competitive atmosphere, and then you put administrators in a difficult position because they have to choose what to focus on. I think what we're not naming are the racist undertones of expenditures in schools. If I have more police and less fine arts instructors, what does that say about how I value those young people in that school building, right? And so I think we've got to look at how the funding is utilized, and then maybe where those funds might be moved around to better support the needs of the young people in those buildings.
Next question.
I want to get back to what we really came here for, and that is to speak on this decision that's going to be made that is going to affect these students. And I have attended quite a few of the school boards. I've attended focus groups. But what about, we have talked about, as community people, the disparity of African American teachers, administrators in the school system. We have talked about the bias of school board members against African American students. We're talking about special groups that become the voice of the community to get their agenda passed and not in the interest of all the students. So the narrative keeps changing. And the panel, Mrs. Imani has stated it quite about long term. We're still talking about equity of African American students in this community. Let's not get distracted about busing and all of that. We're talking about our kids deserve the same quality of education, whether they go across town, go around the corner, or wherever they go. And I am really getting tired of hearing the narrative about poor kids have to get on the bus. We've been on the bus for years.
Okay.
So it's time out for all that kind of talk.
Yeah.
Because we made it, but nobody came and said, oh, isn't that sad that they got to ride the bus all the way across town? But all of a sudden now that becomes the narrative. But we're saying we want our children to be educated and given the same opportunities for success as any other students. And if you're talking about students and you organize a group, you should talk about all the students.
And I think that is part of what prompted the choice system in the first place, was unequal busing, right?
Yes, yes, the not enough seats on the north side of town, because not just in Champaign, but in communities across the country, the older part of town is where poor people live, and Black people historically have been synonymous with poor people. And so we had the oldest buildings, the oldest homes, the oldest schools. So as they started closing schools down, of course they're going to close the older ones down, which are on our side of town. And so it's just this ripple effect. But again, like Miss Jackie said, this ain't about who we're sitting next to. It's about equity and excellence in education.
I just wanted to make a point, and I texted it as well. Southside is a two-strand school. All the schools on this list, Harry Busey, Booker T. Washington, Westview, those are all 3 to 4 strand schools. So when someone is saying that how many kids go to the school is how much money the school gets, that doesn't really apply to why they're wanting to change a school like Southside or even Harry Busey. When I want to say, I call them McMansions. I don't want to insult anybody who lives there, but when those residential areas were being built up, people like me who had just moved here, because we moved here in 1993 and bought our first house in 95 in Old Champaign by Southside and Elm Street Boulevard and State Street, so by the public library, for the sake of the public library. Because we didn't have kids, but we knew we wanted to have access to the public library. So what I'm saying is, Many people bought their homes according to schools. We bought these older houses. My friends bought houses on Hill Street, Columbia, and were remodeling and renovating for the sake of being able to go to schools like, back then, Columbia. The Stratton wasn't there. So we had the forethought that we wanted to live in those older neighborhoods. So we supported our older neighborhoods. We supported Edison to be remodeled. We supported the public library to be remodeled. We knew our property taxes were going to go up. But back then, and even now, property taxes are not like that in Champaign. So everybody's property tax goes up. And Champaign built themselves on Prospect Avenue to give revenue to our public schools. And so we need to remember those things when people who are not from Champaign, we need to remember and remind them what Champaign was, our history of how we treated our Black population, but we also have to remember that we have been trying to solve that. It's just been, we've been solving it for too long. And people know me, and so if I do not speak my truth, because I'm not African American, but I had to be defined as African American. I'm not a Muslim, and yet people want to define me as Muslim. Okay, so if I don't stand up and speak about the inequalities that I keep seeing in our schools, then I'm not going to be truthful to all the children that all of us need to be better educated.
Okay, so I have a question here that's, I think it would be better to start, and maybe this is our last question, because it's 7:07, but I think it would be better to start with the immoral opportunity gaps between white and Black children, and then have a community committee work on solving those issues and put them into place. What do our panelists think about the best process might look like? I mean, I wonder if your pick committee from, the 90s and early 2000s would be a model, because that was successful for a while,
I'd love to see something like that again. What's your?
I think it's certainly getting folks at the table and building the table so that folks can participate when they are there. But I think beyond that, it is one thing that oftentimes is missing from participatory campaigns or participatory democracy initiatives is the need to continuously educate ourselves to unlearn the things that we need to unlearn. That's right. I happened to see a picture on the screen that said "change, not chaos" on many posters. What does that mean? And so, do parents have the will to come together to interrogate a message like that?
Yeah.
Right? And until we do, then we will continue to make decisions like we see unfold, not just in Champaign, but all across the country. And so until we can come together to unlearn the things we need to unlearn and that we've often forgotten about, then we're going to continue to reproduce the sort of society we live in today. And so that political education is what I call it, yes, becomes critical for any sort of movement towards equity or justice in schools, in my opinion, as well.
We used to call it PE.
There you go.
PE?
Political education.
Nice. Okay, another question. Do we have time for another question?
I'll let you.
I have a great question here that I think I want to hear about the effect of change, not the history of what happened back then and what we are doing now. How will they change the teacher's perspective from treating Black children differently from white? Dr. Wilson, I think this is part of what you do.
Yeah, so I think that ultimately the teachers have to have the will to do the transformative work, but I think there are some accountability systems, and these are not punitive systems. I'm not talking about punishing people, but how often do Champaign schools pause to engage in that unlearning exercise I just described? And as a result, and if they do pause, how often are they focusing on test data?
Yeah, I do. I
Right?
mean,
And so where do the priorities lie? And then how do we also lie on our state standards? So I work in social studies. Over the last 5 years, the state standards for social studies have changed to say you can no longer just teach a white, cis, heterosexual male version of history. You must include all people's stories in there, including black folks, including Asian folks, including labor history, including LGBTQIA history. And we must not just see students as empty vessels. We must allow them to show us how brilliant they are by transforming our classrooms into spaces that allow students to ask questions, collect information, analyze that information, and take action. The state standards say that is social studies.
Yeah.
So then I think when we use the standards, when we use professional learning experiences, Champaign Schools is right down the street from my office, and that's some accountability for me as well to go to Champaign Public Schools to offer some support. But I think these things have got to be done in coalition with not just university partners, because we don't know nothing either, right? It has to be done in partnership with parents, with young people, and with educational whomever folks that work in schools. I won't call us experts.
and
Can everyone hear me?
one thing I wanted to mention when we've talked before, you mentioned this idea of classrooms where students get to decide what they're going to learn. Would you want to talk about that very quickly?
Yeah, that was kind of what I just described earlier. So this is called inquiry-based learning, right? It might have been called popular education back in the day or in some out-of-school spaces, but essentially social studies and science in the state of Illinois must be subjects where students have control over the questions they ask about science and social studies, and that really is the world around them. They collect information through data collection, through a number of ways, make sense of that information, and take action. What if schools were those sort of spaces where we charge young people with tackling and taking on and addressing and solving the sort of issues we think we know everything about? I think we might be in a different sort of situation 10 years from now if we were to engage in that. The other thing I will offer as an example for everybody to take a look at, and this is a model engaged in school systems all across the country, is sustainable community schools. They work when districts invest in them. And that's that sort of model that you were talking about, where there is community-based programming, there's culturally sustaining and responsive curriculum and education, there's professional learning for teachers, for parents, and students, and there is a quest and aspiration towards equity, love, and justice.
And another thing we've worked on is getting the district to agree that we would do community-based schooling. So again, some stuff has been lost that we need more people to raise. I tell y'all, I got goo-gobs of stuff to share with proposals and that kind of thing. And I've mentioned several times, we put systems in place, we looked at curriculum and all of that, and one of the things that the district agreed to was prioritizing inquiry-based learning, because that is a progressive approach to education that all kids can respond to. What happened to that?
One thing that I want to add, you were asking how often Champaign invests in, or how often do they do teacher training on things like unlearning racism. I know that the current superintendent, Sheila Boozer, is one of her favorite things is AVID. We talked about this a little bit, and I don't fully understand AVID, but I think...
Oh, I know it.
Yeah, I think, so they did a recent workshop all about that where a bunch of teachers were there. Do you want to comment? Is AVID close to what you're talking about, or not at all?
So all I can say is from my experience in Chicago Public Schools, I think Chicago Public Schools spent something like $20 million a year adopting this AVID program, which is essentially, it is much more than this, so I'm not trying to knock AVID, but it teaches students how to take good quality notes that they can use in the future in an organized fashion. Oh. And so $20 million on note-taking, or $20 million on play and exploration and science and music and art. That everybody in the room, I think, would sway one way or the other. We have to ask the question: why do we then use expenditures in these ways or not?
I think Dr. Fashola has a disagreement as well.
So, can you hear me? Can you hear me? So, a couple of things.
Right. And I'm not saying I don't know if Champaign is investing $20 million in the AVID program. I think that's a question to bring up.
Yeah, but Dr. Fashola, I think it is. Okay. Yeah, I'd love to talk to you more afterwards. Dr. Fashola also has, I think, some thoughts on this. As enunciated as you can.
So, a couple of things. The first thing is trying to answer the original question. I think we're moving off the topic a little bit, but the first thing is when you talked about the group of people, we have to engage in uncomfortable decisions. The different groups of people, those who agree and those who disagree with, those who understand and those who do not understand the inequities of schooling as it is right now in Champaign, must come together, right? And have very, very uncomfortable conversations about what is going on with our children and with the schools. And unless those conversations
so what
take
you're
place,
saying is we need to have uncomfortable conversations. I heard that.
That's number one. Number two, AVID is more than note-taking. I am not invested in AVID, but it stands for Advancement via Individual Determination. It is a college attendance / dropout prevention program that teaches students to do a lot more than just take notes. It invests in the future of teachers, in the future of students, especially students from underprivileged backgrounds. And if and when implemented well, these students will go on not only to graduate from high school, but to attend and succeed in college.
So I think you're saying it works, like students graduate, who are from backgrounds where that might be, that's the investment we want, so they're getting the success that we want. Is that what I'm understanding?
I'm not saying, yes, I believe in the art.
Okay. Since it's hard for us to hear, would one of our audience members want to talk a little bit about?
Is it out? Yeah, it is. Okay. So I wouldn't want us to, thank you for putting that slide back up. I would not want us to have a discussion here without acknowledging some of the structural and process issues experienced here in our district. Change Not Chaos it started out as a group of parents who heard what was going on, realized the information was not being well communicated. It was a large change. No papers went home in backpacks. No signs went up on electronic signage. There was no signage inside of the school. Materials were not being translated into the multiple languages spoken at home. And so the backlash that we saw, much of the backlashes in the community, was to look around and say, who's not in the room? Who's not part of this conversation? Where the heck is the community steering committee? What happened to the committees that were working on some of these issues? We talk about the Triple E committee, the Choice committee. Where are the minutes? Who's involved? How do we get engaged? In many ways, members of the community have hit brick walls when it comes to some of this work. And we know that I know that if it came down to suing the district to get change going, like you said, are we going to have to sue somebody again in order to get the level of community information and engagement so that we can try to have collaborative? I grew up in problem-based learning, inquiry-based, inquiry-driven learning. I'm a product of the Chicago public school system and the state of Illinois' public school system. So when we think that we are trying to have collaborative, community-based partnerships, I also came out of a lot of work in neighborhood improvement initiatives in small multicultural communities. Rooms like this filled with the community members. Rooms like this, Post-it notes everywhere, snow charts everywhere, 40 different nonprofit organizations, churches, IT people, everyone represented, talking, engaging, trying to understand what's going on, putting our arms around our community's children and meaning it. And so, we can have whatever critiques we may have about programs like AVID. I want to know what happens when the district engages community members in committees and such. Why then do we not hear what happened once there was, I was on the Gifted Task Force. Why did we not hear what happened once those recommendations were made? Why was nothing adopted? Why was a program dismantled and nothing really communicated back to the community about what happened? Why did the Triple E committee's work, why did that peter out? Why do we have to FOIA to get these records, these reports that can help us have an informed conversation and understanding of what's going on in our district? So I appreciate you all taking the time. I appreciate you giving this context. I think a couple months ago on this side of town, there was a meeting where people who were in charge of how choice used to be done were in the room, teaching folks in the room about how at one point it kind of worked. We've lost so much of what we know. And when I heard that you all invited the communications person here, and where are they? Where are those efforts to engage and understand and follow up, translate, interpret? Where are those efforts from our district? And I understand that resources are limited when it comes to bandwidth from where we are in space and time. And I also understand that if we're going to come up with good community-based decisions and outcomes, then we have to be present and we have to hold each other accountable.
Yeah. I think turnover is some of the answer of, we have some last questions?
Let me just say that one of the things we need to definitely do is look at the administration as a trickle on down from the administration to the teachers, to the custodians, to the students. Who do we have that is concerned about our children within the school system? I mean, they're really concerned about our children, black, white, Asian, what have you. And if they are concerned about our children, they will do what's necessary to be done to educate our children. You have to have not only the community coming to the meetings that we have, but they have to be a part of the administration in the schools, the teachers in the schools. We have basically, and we be truthful about it, we have mostly white teachers in all of our schools. You can count the number of African American teachers Asian teachers on your hands that are in all the schools over in Champaign and Urbana. And that is a big problem. They don't know our children. How can they teach them? We need to have that happen. If you spend the money, if you spend $21,000, $40,000, do we have the people that care about our children?
And sir, are you a former board member? No. Okay.
I'm a pastor here in town.
Oh, okay. Nice to meet you.
I'm of the Ministerial Alliance of Education.
Oh, okay.
Who agreed to be very involved, by the way, in the Promise Church initiative that was the first rollout for the Promise Zone. And I'm hoping that we can reclaim that.
So this is just a really quick comment. I got to go on the record and tell you guys that Jamie Roundtree at Booker T. Washington is doing a phenomenal job.
He's a good brother.
He is a cool principal. No?
Oh. Okay. My only, all I've seen is when I've been in the school and he's known every single student's name that are walking down the halls. No, it wasn't in the office. We were walking through the halls. We were.
So I appreciate both perspectives. I'm going to say we're going to wrap this up, and Kimberly, we're going to wrap this up. Emily, go ahead and wrap this up, and thank our panelists, and thank everybody for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Asif Wilson, who is an education professor at the University of Illinois here in Urbana-Champaign. Miss Imani Bazzell, who is a longtime activist in our community. Dr. Toks Fashola, who has so many pearls of wisdom from American University, and it's our fault that we didn't get to hear that properly. She really is great. And thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it.
We're done.
Thank you.
I just want to say for the record that we have a Black woman who is the superintendent, and it's really important that we hold her accountable, but it's also equally important that we support her as a Black woman in her efforts to bring leadership to this district. And so, as a Black woman, I'm not going to participate in any conversations or any efforts that are going to be about dragging her through the dirt, which we have parents organized who are giving her the blues, and we need to be aware of that.